Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I am your host, Doug McKenty. This is episode 4. My guest today is Tom Secker. This is recorded on Wednesday, July 12th, 2017. If you're interested in what you're hearing, please check out our Patreon account. That's patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to find out more information, you can check us out on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Or join the conversation on Twitter at @DMcKenty. So my guest on the program today is British-based writer and researcher Tom Secker, co-author of the book National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. This book compiles a new data set acquired through a Freedom of Information Act request and outlines a disturbing pattern of influence by elements within the U.S. military-industrial complex over many of the most popular movies and TV shows produced out of Hollywood, spanning back many decades. It provides specific examples of many film and television programs whose scripts were significantly altered to paint the U.S. military and American foreign policy in a positive light. The book will leave you wondering where the line between pop culture and government propaganda is drawn, or if there is even a line drawn at all. Tom's specialties include the history of security services, Hollywood, and terrorism, and his research has appeared in The Mirror, The Express, Russia Today, Salon, Tech Dirt, and elsewhere. Check out spyculture.com for more info, and listen to Tom's podcast, Clandestine. Hi, Tom. How's it going today?
Yeah, I'm good, Doug. Thanks for having me on. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. I've always found this to be one of the most fascinating topics. Just exactly how much propaganda is inserted into all these films and TV shows that we're all watching every day. So I just want to, why don't you just start with giving us a little bit of a background about yourself, and then kind of introducing how you got into this topic, and then I think how you got this new trove of information via a Freedom of Information Act request.
Okay, well, I guess, some people might be familiar with my work going back a few years. I published a book in 2013 called Secret Spies in 7/7, which was all about the 2005 London bombings. And I've previously made 2 video documentaries, YouTube documentaries about the bombings. Mm-hmm. So some people may be familiar with some of that. But after I wrote that book in 2013, or around the time I was finishing it in 2012, actually, I was wondering what was a topic that got me away from having to read grisly autopsy reports and unpleasant stuff like that, that as important as, I believe the questions of state terrorism are, at that point I just kind of wanted a new thing to sink my teeth into and to try and get somewhere with as a research topic. And I noticed that this was a subject that was getting more attention in academia around that time. So I wondered, is this a good point to... I'd always wondered about this question, I read a lot of spy novels when I was younger, I guess, is where my interest comes from. And I'd always wondered, how many of these people writing these things are spies or were spies? How much of this is real? How much of this is in some way a result of the security services, let's say? And so it's a natural topic for me to kind of move into. And with the 7/7 thing, with the London bombings thing, I should say, a lot of the popular theories, both kind of official theories and alternative theories, a lot of those, I think, were encouraged by popular culture. When I looked into this in some detail, I found countless examples of these exact narratives that then, after the bombings, became very popular in one circle or another, in TV shows like Spooks and various films and other TV series as well. And so from that, I set up the site, spyculture.com. I started archiving everything on there that I could find through the National Archives on this. And then I thought, time to start filing some Freedom of Information requests and see what more up-to-date information can actually be got. Because I couldn't find anyone else really doing that, or not on any significant scale. So I thought, why not? I'd spent a lot of time working with the Freedom of Information Act when I was investigating terrorism and so on, getting FBI files on terrorism cases, that sort of thing. So I knew how to do this. And so from maybe 2014 right up until now, I still have at this moment, probably a dozen different requests in with various branches of different governments. I've just been filing them, dozens and dozens of these things, trying to get everything that we can so that we actually have some hard data to look at. Because it's all well and good speculating about government involvement in propaganda, but I wanted to know, what can we actually get that's confirmed, and let's maybe build up from there. That's as good a foundation as we can get. So that's what I went after. And ultimately this led to me and Matt writing the book.
So who else had information? There was in the book you described that there was basically like one other person that had access to this information before you got it through the Freedom of Information Act, and that they were sort of pro-government, that they weren't letting a lot of it out, so there hadn't been a lot of research done in this area before you were able to start looking into it.
Well, to be clear, most of the information we have is... Actually, no, I suppose that's not true. A lot of it is more up-to-date, a lot of it is also historical. But most of the pre-2003, maybe, stuff doesn't exist in the Pentagon's archives anymore, because they turned it over to a friendly academic, a guy called Lawrence Seward, who keeps all of this stuff in a private archive in a library in Georgetown. And he basically won't let other people in to look at this stuff. Various academics have asked him, various journalists have asked him. The only time I think anyone gained access to it for any significant period of time was the investigative journalist David Robb, and that was nearly 15 years ago now. Well, over 10 years ago now. And he wrote a book called Operation Hollywood. But we wanted to see, having read Robb's book and having seen this, got to be some more information about this. There's got to be some more dynamite in this. This can't be the sum total of the Pentagon's manipulation of film scripts. We just went after it. So a lot of the stuff we've got isn't the same stuff as what's in Seward's archive. That's the thing. He's got a lot of older stuff going back probably to the 1920s. We've tried to get as much of the new stuff, the modern, up-to-date information, which in particular reveals things like, and this is something none of the commentary on this topic had ever really picked up on before, but that this involves thousands of TV episodes. I mean, we document in the book over 1,100 TV shows, and that's just titles, that's just different actual shows. If you count up the individual episodes, you're probably looking at least double that number, have been supported and in some way influenced by the Pentagon. So this is a massive thing, and frankly we found Seward's commentary rather conservative and not exactly pro-war, but certainly not very critical of this process, and certainly not very critical of what the Pentagon does in these operations, I guess you'd call them. So our approach is very different. Let me say that much. Our perspective is different.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things about just even looking at the approach, and I wanted to talk about this with you, is that it comes across as like it's a subtle means of propaganda. It's not in your face type of propaganda. And so I can almost see how somebody could look at it and say, oh gosh, it's not that big of a deal. But then when you see, like you brought up already, the size and the scope of it, and then later on in the interview, I definitely like to get into specific details about the kinds of changes that they make that are, again, seem subtle, but then because of the size and the scope of it, or you know, all the changes throughout, say, one movie, then it's just like the attitude changes a little bit. You know, what was a powerful anti-war movie still comes across as kind of anti-war, but the soldiers are the good guys, or, you know, something like that. So they just twist it. It's not like, I don't know, you know, it's not like what you think of as old style Soviet propaganda where it's just in your face, you know, that, you know, we love communism or we love capitalism or something like that. It's this very subtle transformation that they go script by script and make just enough changes that it just changes the feeling of the movie until you come out being, you know, sort of pro-military, and you don't even exactly know why, you know?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, some of it isn't very subtle. If you look at a movie like Battleship, I don't know if you've ever seen Battleship, but it's pretty awful.
Right.
Just as a piece of entertainment, it's not well crafted or original or anything like that. But that is pretty obviously a pro-military movie. That is akin to the sorts of things that were being made in 1920s Russia or in 1930s Germany or whatever.
Right.
But that, I guess, is a kind of extreme example. And actually, the Entertainment Liaison Office reports that we got described it as a pro-military chest thumper. That's the way they thought of it. And I think that's actually a very accurate description, but it shows you, they know what they're dealing with here. These people aren't stupid or at all. Like you say, they're subtle. They're clever people who are just making little changes here, or if we remove that joke there, then it makes the whole scene just feel a little bit different. And so it usually isn't the storyline or a major change to a character. It's usually just small details that added up over time, over dozens and dozens, if not possibly hundreds and hundreds of movies, and potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of TV shows. It adds up to quite a lot, just in terms of the influence that these things have. I mean, let's face it, everyone in pop culture copies everyone else, right? So if you have the biggest films kind of setting, these are the standards, this is how you make a war movie, this is how you make an action movie about the military battling against alien invaders or whatever, then other people copy that. And so long term, I think it does have quite a lot of influence over the pop culture and thus over people's mindsets.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like this subtle form of social engineering that it just builds up over time. It's not in your face. I think most Americans, gosh, I bet most Americans, when you're talking about state propaganda, they just don't even believe that it exists. Or if it does, maybe a little here and there, but certainly not in my movies or in my TV shows. And they have no idea that behind the scenes is actually this massive operation that is transforming the pop culture of our time. Can you discuss? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think generally speaking, quite a lot of people are quite cynical about news these days, about news media. A lot of them will say, oh, that's just propaganda for whoever, this, that, and the other, particularly if it's the news media that's on the opposite end of the political spectrum to themselves.
Right.
But when it comes to entertainment, that's not something that I think people in the West think is, or in as much as they recognize it as a vehicle for propaganda, it's just like, oh, Hollywood makes a lot of war movies. Well, yeah, it does, but there's more to it than that. There's something more subtle and sophisticated going on that's much more intentional. There's no kind of mistake being made here. They haven't accidentally censored this stuff from these movies.
Right.
So I think that's something, certainly. While people may be somewhat aware or cynical about propaganda in other areas, they generally aren't when it comes to Hollywood.
So let's talk a little bit about the process then. You mentioned the Entertainment Liaison Office. So what is this, and then how does it work, and who is responsible for looking at the scripts? How do they have leverage over the producers so they can change the scripts, this kind of thing?
Okay. Well, there's a guy called Phil Strubb. He is the Pentagon's Director of Entertainment Media, or their main Hollywood liaison. And he's been in the job since the late 80s. He took over from a guy called Don Baruch, who had it before for about 40 years. There's only two guys ever had this job. And they are in overall charge of this. They work in the Pentagon at the Secretary for Public Affairs. Out in Los Angeles, there are several small offices, relatively small offices, one for each branch of the military. So Navy, Air Force, Army, even the Coast Guard have their own office out in Los Angeles, and that's the main point of contact for filmmakers, TV producers, and so on. So they phone them up or email them and say, we want to make this film, and we want to film at this Air Force base, and maybe have a couple of these helicopters in the background in one scene, and could we have a squadron of Marines to, do something in this scene? And they say, okay, you need to send us the script. They won't do anything unless you send them the script, or at least the story outline, or whatever it is that you've got. And they review it line by line. And the guy who ultimately has the say as to whether the support is actually granted in the end is Phil Strubb. But he does talk with various different branches of the military. Now, normally it would just be how are the Marine Corps being portrayed in this film? So you send it to the Marines and they have a look at it and they make, they send back some notes or some comments or something and they say, we're happy with this, we're not happy with that. With some films, though, like Clear and Present Danger, it took them 6 months because they were sending this to all sorts of different departments within the Pentagon, like the Drugs Task Force, people like that. So loads of different people were reviewing this script and saying, oh, we would like this changed, we want that changed, we don't like that scene at all. And it resulted in that case, quite a spectacular rewriting of the script. The original script was much closer to the book, and the finished film really isn't, to be honest. But that's how the process works, is the requests come in, they look at them, they say, we're going to go through your script line by line, and then they give them script notes. They send them literal notes like a producer in a studio would, where they say, page 57, change this bit of dialogue. Page 90, we don't want that piece of action, whatever. And the producers basically have to make these changes or they don't get the access to the people or the Air Force Base or the whatever it is that they want. And so, as a result, the Pentagon actually has quite a lot of leverage over these people. It isn't functioning, as you say, like a sort of Soviet censorship bureau as such, but it is like, well, your other option is to go and spend 20 times as much money doing the whole thing by CGI, or to not make the movie. So most of the time, they just acquiesce. They just go along with this.
I think one of my favorite quotes in the book was when you quoted about Black Hawk Down, that if Black Hawk Down hadn't gotten the okay from the Pentagon to make the movie, it would have been called Huey Down because there was no way they were going to get the Black Hawks to make the movie.
Well, yeah, exactly. And how can you make Black Hawk Down without Black Hawk?
Right.
So, yeah. No, I think that was something Ridley Scott said. I think he said it on the DVD.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, it really does make an enormous amount of difference. There's another, what's his name? Ivar Bryce, who produces the Transformers series. He basically said the first film, they couldn't have made it without the Pentagon. They just couldn't have done it. Top Gun couldn't have been made without Pentagon support.
Sure.
And there are some films that haven't been made as a result of not wanting to go along with this process. So it does function as a kind of censorship bureau, but it's a softer form of censorship that's more about making demands and manipulating the thing rather than, just going in there all ham-fisted saying you have to do this, you can't do that.
Right, I think you mentioned that Top Gun 2 actually did not get produced as a result of this process because of the tailhook scandal that was going on at the time with the Navy. And they didn't want any more bad press about it, so they just didn't let them make that movie.
Well, not at the time. It is actually being made now.
Right.
And in all honesty, they approached for the sequel that they're now making with Tom Cruise, remarkably enough.
Huh.
He's going to look a lot older than he did then.
Yeah, right.
But that film, I think, still hasn't been filmed yet. But they approached the Air Force over this, and they approached the military over this back in, I think, 2012. That's how early on in the process they were going to the military and saying, oh, we think we'll want this, and, what do you want to get out of it, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So I think they learned from when they tried to make the sequel back in the early 90s, and it was, oh, no, we have this big tailhook scandal, and this is partly being blamed on the so-called Top Gun effect, which is a kind of copycat effect. People saw the movie Top Gun and they reckoned this somehow motivated these Navy officers to go on a kind of sexual assault rampage in a hotel. I don't know quite where they got that idea from, but okay.
Yeah, right? That's interesting.
That doesn't really happen in Top Gun, as I remember.
Right. But it shut down the production of the sequel just because these Navy guys didn't want it to happen, so it didn't happen. I mean, that's censorship right there, really.
Well, and it got shelved for 20 years.
Right.
That's a long time for a movie to be sitting on the shelf, particularly when the first was so popular and successful. So, yeah, it is a powerful force, the Entertainment Liaison Office Network. It is.
So let's go back and talk about Black Hawk Down for a few minutes, because this to me was the kind of the epitome of the type of transformation that a script can go through. Where you're looking at Black Hawk Down, another good example was Avatar, so we could talk about Avatar a little bit as well. But in Black Hawk Down, you've got a situation where it really could have been profoundly anti-war, and it sort of comes across kind of like that if you're watching the movie. But I think you mentioned one of the things is that you mentioned in the book is like they take the whole thing out of context. So you don't get what the American military had been doing to the people in Mogadishu in the months prior to what happened, which kind of sets the stage and puts the military in a little bit of a negative light because there was some shooting of civilians and things like that. And then the other thing that you talk about, and this happens a lot in movies, where the overall movie might almost have an anti-war feeling, but then the movie becomes about the soldiers, and all the soldiers are the good guys. So at the end of the movie, you love the soldiers no matter what the big picture really is. You almost forget about the bigger picture.
Well, sure, you're right. I mean, the reality of the provocation, the background to the Black Hawk Down incident, the real one, like you say, been going on for months. It was at times pretty violent. So this didn't come out of nowhere. This wasn't just some bunch of fanatics who one day decided to do this for no apparent reason. Whereas the movie, and Hollywood does this time after time, it presents it as a piece of contextless history. It's like, this did really happen, but we're not going to seriously look at the reasons why. We're not going to interrogate that in any way. It's just, this happened, and these were the consequences. Because we want to tell a dramatic story where something happens, and then there's consequences. And so that's all they really do. And like you say, this has the function not just of excluding the real context and the real build-up and provocation to this incident, but it also excludes what in the book is a pretty consistent, at least criticism of the Pentagon. Maybe not strictly anti-war in like the most basic sense, but certainly very critical of Pentagon's operations and of its mentality that, blundering around the world, sooner or later things like this are just going to happen. If that's the way you operate, then this is inevitable and unavoidable. None of that really makes it into the film. And instead, like you say, we end up with this story. It's a personal story about a bunch of guys, basically. It's almost a buddy adventure story, but set in an action war context. And so as a result, our emotions and our sympathies are all invested in the soldiers themselves. And, are they going to make it out? Is this going to be okay in the end? Rather than the question of, well, why were they there? How did they end up there? What led up to this? Why is this even happening? All of that ends up getting excluded in favor of a narrative which is just about people. And of course, anyone wants to sympathize with someone in a difficult situation. And so, again, as a result, the anti-war sentiment gets very much diluted down and sidelined in favor of a human interest story, almost. So, yeah, if you read the book and then you watch the film, you will wonder why it is that the film is so different. Now, Hollywood would do this anyway. They do this anyway with lots of other things that aren't sponsored by the government or supported by the government in any way. But in this case, some of these changes were made by the Pentagon, and certainly the general shift in tone and shift in philosophy, you might say, is something they encouraged and supported. And they wouldn't have supported the film had it gone, had it gone in the other direction. Had it said, no, we've got to maintain that mentality from the book because that's what this story is actually about. But no, they sidelined or just got rid of that. And had they not done that, the Pentagon wouldn't have agreed. And even on that, there are one of the changes on that, the Ewan McGregor character, they changed the name of the soldier because in real life, that soldier went on to rape a child.
Right.
And they didn't want to draw any attention to that. They didn't want people Googling that guy's name, basically. And so things like that just make you wonder, that's how cynical they are. That's how prone to avoiding the consequences they are, is that they don't even want you to think that a soldier might one day rape a child. They don't want that entering the dialogue about the military, because that obviously just makes them look very, very bad. Whether they're to blame for that in any way or not, they just, they don't want that being part of the popular dialogue. They don't want that being out there for public consumption. That's censorship, right?
Right. I mean, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, you're taking a book that can be profoundly anti-war, and you're making a movie that is so watered down that anti-war sentiment is essentially gone by the time you're done with it. It's really surprising.
It's not part of the emotional engagement of the film. It's just part of the kind of background noise.
Well, I think that you're onto something there, because those are the subtle differences that can be made. It doesn't look like propaganda because you take a step back and you go, well, this looks like an anti-war film, so how can it be propaganda? But as you're saying, the emotional engagement makes any anti-war message something that's in the backdrop. Like, it's no longer the focus of this film. It may be something that if you think about it, pretty hard, you might get that message. But if you watch the movie, you're just cheering for the main characters, and you're caring about what's going on with them. Why don't we talk about Avatar for a few minutes? Because that was a huge movie that seemed on its face to have this, anti-corporate, anti-war, anti-colonial message. But then after you watch the movie, you don't come out of it, wanting American foreign policy to change, right? I mean, because the Marine is the good guy. The Marine is the one that stands up and does the right thing.
Well, I mean, to be fair, the Avatar case study that we did in the book was primarily written by my co-author. But, I mean, I agree with what he said there. And it is clear that movie had the veneer of being anti-war, the veneer of some more hopeful or, I don't know, progressive, peaceful, whatever label you want to stick on it. Just something better, something better than this rampaging militarism, because there just has to be something better than that. And it did, on the face of it, that is in there. It is a story about indigenous people who are attacked, and our sympathies are with the indigenous people, right? But one of the crucial things is that they're not being attacked by, like, the United States military. They're being attacked essentially by a private corporation. This is a resource war being conducted by, like, Halliburton, or whatever the equivalent would be.
Right.
So the blame is not really on the national military, the security state. The blame is more on callous capitalists who will happily just murder and plunder for profit. But even then, is that really where they place the blame in the film? I mean, that's the thing. On the surface, a lot of these different ideas are in there. But deep down, did anyone come out of that film thinking, you know what, resource wars are really destructive and stupid?
Right, exactly.
Because that idea is in there, but it's not really the takeaway from the film. So there again, we wonder. We didn't manage to get any specific script notes on this, but we do know that the Marine Corps met with James Cameron, that they provided him with notes on the script, that they had people on set for some of the filming, that I think they even invited him in for some special event afterwards. So this seems a lot more than just some, like, casual courtesy support for, trying to get the dialogue right for the Marine character. It seems they had a bit more influence over the film than that, which is all they really want to pretend they had. And we do suspect, in that case, that maybe in earlier drafts of the script, the attacking force was more akin to the United States military, that it was a rather obvious metaphor for that, rather than the, again, diluted, watered down version that we actually ended up with. And as Matt said, we did a different interview on a friend of mine's radio station last week, maybe. He pointed out, has any film, or any film this big, like Avatar, that's took $2 billion or something, has any other film had less cultural resonance? I mean, who cares about Avatar anymore?
Right.
What influence did the film ultimately have? It got seen by everyone. It made buckets of money. It was enormously popular. It was in all the media. But it added up to nothing.
Yeah, I've had an interesting idea in the past, that is that we watch these movies to get these emotions. Like, they make these movies to get these emotions out of us so that we don't hold on to them and actually try to do something in real life. Like, we watch a Die Hard movie or a movie like Avatar or one of the Terminator movies or something, and any idea that we had that we wanted to fight the man, we got that, all those emotions out watching the movie, and now we don't have time or energy to really fight the man anymore.
No, sure. They give you that kind of emotional work through.
Right.
So it's so you come out of it feeling like, okay, yeah, I've managed to project my anger about the destruction in the world onto this fictional character in a movie.
Exactly.
And so I've had my little fix of that. I can go back to my tedious office job and forget all about the problems of the world and get on with it.
Absolutely. I think that's actually kind of huge. That's something that people don't talk about very much, but that our entertainment is used, because you get so many of these ideas in entertainment, you would think that they would become reflected, these anti-corporate ideas. I wanted to go back and talk about this concept we touched on already, but you describe it as called civilianizing in the book, which is the technique of taking something that maybe in the original script was military and then turning it into a contractor or a corporation or some kind of civilian operation, so the military doesn't really get blamed for it, even though at the end of the day in the real world, I mean, is there even a distinction between the corporations and the military at this point? I don't think so. But, in the minds of the people watching a movie, it does make a huge difference. Suddenly it's a military contractor instead of, the United States military would never do anything like this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think this is one of those things that they do when they can't change something in a script, whether it be a character's identity or a location or a piece of dialogue, whatever. When they can't just get rid of it, because getting rid of it would make, it would screw up the whole scene. It, means they have to make two big changes, and the script writers are probably going to come back saying, come on, that isn't really fair. They just say, well, okay, can you make him a civilian character? So at the start of Jurassic Park 3, for example, you have this military guy, basically a renegade explorer with no real fear for the consequences of his actions, riding around looking for this dinosaur island, and he finds the dinosaur island. And this is what, of course, causes all the chaos and the rampage and all the rest of it throughout the rest of the movie. And they didn't like the idea of this guy being military. They're this sort of, reckless renegade type character. Mm-hmm. So they said, can you just get him out of a uniform? Just make him the president's science advisor or something like that. Anything else, just get him out of a uniform. And so they did. And I mean, the bizarre thing with Jurassic Park 3 is that they originally approached the Pentagon saying, we need a couple of A-10 gunships because we want a scene where they're fighting with pterodactyls. And the Pentagon came back and said, oh, no. We're not having our, high-grade gunships blasting pterodactyls out of the sky. That's not a good look for us. People will feel sorry for the dinosaurs and they won't like the military. So, no, that scene just gets scrapped from the movie. But he says, but at the end, we can have the Marines turn up and rescue the people from the island. So, the military looks like the hero. And so, as a result, right, the military's role in that script went from being some reckless idiot flying around looking for dinosaurs just to, and causing all this trouble, and blasting pterodactyls out of the sky with high-powered weaponry. So that gets changed. Oh, no, they're no longer that. They're the guys who turn up at the end and rescue people. It completely changes their role in the movie. So that's the extent to which they can manipulate a script. And civilianization, like I say, it's one of these quite common techniques. We also saw this in Hulk. We also saw this in Contact. We also saw this in Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, a recent Tina Fey comedy. There's a whole bunch of examples we could get into. I mean, where do you want to go with this?
Well, it is just amazing, what you've discovered, that literally thousands of TV shows and movies over the years have been influenced in this way. Not just a couple, not just here and there, but this major program that's influencing almost everything that we watch. Why don't we switch gears a little bit and just go into a little bit more about the history of how long they've been doing this, and also not just the Pentagon, but I know the CIA, and maybe not so much now, but in the past, the FBI also engaging in this kind of propaganda work.
Well, sure. I mean, the Pentagon started this in the 1910s, so 100 years ago now, more than 100 years ago.
Wow.
And in total, we reckon the number is over 800 movies that they've worked on since then. Now, we're not saying every single one of those was subject to this kind of manipulation, but it is a case of, in all of the cases where we've been able to get hard evidence, they've been this kinds of script changes have been in there somewhere. So we can only assume in an awful lot of those cases they were subject to this kind of manipulation. So, yeah, we're talking about hundreds of movies going back a century. It was only really after World War II that this process became formalized in the Pentagon, and they actually set up the Entertainment Liaison Office structure as we now understand it. So, yeah, they've had a formal process since, I think, 1947, 48. The FBI actually were probably the pioneers of that format, in that they set up their office in the 1930s, and certainly throughout the next 40 years, the whole J. Edgar Hoover period, they had this kind of approach. They would remove the FBI from certain, like if a character was an FBI character and they did something they didn't like, they changed them. They became a private detective or a cop or something else, someone who wasn't FBI. So again, the same sort of process where if we can't rip the whole thing out of the script, we just distance ourselves from it. So our only presence in these products is some kind of benevolent, heroic one. So there's never any, in any of these products, and even in things that they didn't support. There was an episode of what was that show that Alfred Hitchcock made? I think it was just called Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
Yeah.
Where they did this, where there's a character in there that basically advises a woman who is doing something illegal. And in the original script, he's FBI. And through an informant at the studio, it gets back to Hoover that this is what's going to be in the episode. And even though they offered no production support or assistance whatsoever, they managed to lean on the screenwriter to change this. So that's how powerful they could be, that even without someone coming to them and wanting something, they could still operate this kind of censorship and manipulation.
Wow.
And so we don't think the FBI is still like that. I mean, obviously, since Hoover died, they have somewhat faded in relevance. I'm not saying they're unimportant. I'm just saying other agencies, I think, have come to the fore. And in particular, the CIA. Now, the existing kind of historiographies, the existing academic books and what have you on the subject of the CIA in Hollywood, very, very good. But they did miss some stuff. And again, we would suggest they're guilty, or certainly I would suggest they're guilty of a somewhat too conservative approach to this. They almost don't want to go down the road of, well, hang on, does the CIA actually have a strategic mindset for what it's doing in Hollywood? Because we would suggest that the documentation and the examples we managed to put together very much suggest that they do have. And in one chapter of our book, we lay this out. We try and lay out basically the whole history in a very condensed way of what the CIA have been doing in Hollywood since their inception. Because that's the thing, they didn't set up their entertainment liaison office until the 1990s, but we proved that basically they were always operating in some kind of fashion in Hollywood since the late 40s and early 50s. Mm-hmm. So from the get-go, they were doing this. Even from the days when they were only a little agency with 3,000 employees, they still recognized that Hollywood is important. And getting stuff in there and removing stuff from there is important.
Like, I think you mentioned that Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond novels, was a friend of Alan Dulles. I mean, they were working together to kind of craft this James Bond character into something that would make the CIA look good.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far, but certainly they were close friends. They exchanged a lot of correspondence. They did discuss the Bond novels. And the Bond novels did become more of a vehicle for promoting the CIA. I mean, this is something we should remember. Back in the 1950s, when the Bond novels were first coming out, no one really mentioned the CIA. They didn't really talk about them on the news. They weren't mentioned in films, books, whatever. But the CIA, nonetheless, appear in all of the James Bond books. And they are named as such. They are named the CIA. And when Dulles and Fleming became friends in the late 50s, that's when you start to see the Bond novels incorporating more of the Felix Leiter character. He plays a bigger role. He's more prominent. It even references Alan Dulles in a couple of books. I mean,
right.
that's how much Fleming wanted to flatter this guy. So, yeah. And then you get to Thunderball, which is possibly the most pro-CIA of all the Bond novels. And the film adaptation of that was you might say, the prototype for the CIA promoting itself through Hollywood. Because there again, you have the Felix Leiter character, but also they provided some support to that film. At the end of it, you may remember, Bond and Domino were stuck out in the Caribbean, and a plane with a skyhook comes in and rescues them. Never been seen in cinema before. And one of the reasons is because at that time it was basically still a classified technology being used by the CIA, and that plane was actually loaned to the producers by a CIA front company. So, like I say, even back then, there are all these signs that they actually had at least some kind of strategic mindset for promoting themselves and promoting what they wanted to see in Hollywood.
And now you've got shows like 24 and Homeland that are heavily influenced by the CIA, right?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, Homeland is possibly the most CIA-influenced TV show ever, I might suggest. Ever going back to even before the first season, there were producers. There was Claire Danes even was visiting Langley, and this was all done very hush-hush. People didn't know about this at the time. That Claire Danes was going to meet the deputy director of the CIA. Well, obviously that's newsworthy, but the reason why it didn't come out in the news is because the Public Affairs Office said, oh no, this is very hush-hush, we want this, effectively kept quiet. Well, why? I mean, it's kind of trivial, isn't it? Or shouldn't it be? A Hollywood star goes to Langley. I mean, it's kind of dumb, really, in a way. But, so what are they up to? And over time, we've learnt that they've had ex-CIA consultants, they've had active CIA officers helping to work on the script. They now, before each season, the producers and the main creative staff hold a series of meetings in arranged by an ex-CIA agent who's the main consultant on the program. And this is in an old CIA club in Georgetown. And they meet with people from the White House, State Department, CIA, military, all sorts of different agencies to come and say, well, what do you think of the trends that are going to be coming up in the next year? Because because they have this obsession with making Homeland reflect real world events as they're happening. And you have to wonder, for an agency like the CIA, that's just an open invitation to say, well, we'd quite like you to put this in the series,
Right.
And what are the producers going to do? They're desperate for ideas. That's what they're setting up these meetings for. They're saying, come, give us some ideas. We want you to inject something into this. We want you to give us some kind of inspiration and direction for the series. So, yeah, I think watching Homeland, you have to see almost everything in there as the result of this kind of process. I'm not saying everything in there was written by the CIA, obviously. I'm just saying it's a result of this relationship, because it seems to have gone back right to pre-production on the first season, and it seems to go right the way through to today.
It's such the strangest thing about this process really of creating propaganda, that it's not so direct. It's so subtle, it's so behind the scenes that it is difficult. As you say, many of these other academics that have written about this end up having this pretty conservative approach to it. But I have a tendency to agree with you that over time and just enough of these subtle twists, and you end up with some pretty powerful, just emotional changes that end up, I'm sure frustrating the writers who wanted to write a seriously anti-war movie or something about the CIA, and then they end up getting so watered down that the initial idea is lost. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this show 24, because I have this experience. I actually watched the first season of 24, and I remember it because I thought, and I'm asking you this because of your work on terrorism and on 7/7. In 24, we actually had this first season where it was implied that maybe this act of terrorism was an inside job. And I thought, man, are these, like 9/11 truth kind of ideas going mainstream in this show? And then, of course, there's a twist in the plot, and suddenly the CIA becomes the good guy, and by season 2, he's just fighting evil drug dealers in South America. It seems to me like maybe this is even the kind of influence that the CIA might subtly be injecting propaganda into the people by taking a plot that may even seem anti-establishment, and then being able to tweak it so that at the last minute they become the good guys.
Well, I certainly understand where that suspicion comes from, because it appears there is, in reality, the TV, much more so than the films, when you watch the TV series that have been sponsored by or supported by MI5, CIA, whoever, it is curious how often these sorts of ideas find their ways in there.
Mm-hmm.
And you do wonder, do they like that kind of idea? Did they encourage it with the writers? But only in a certain context, in a certain way, and usually with that sort of narrative twist, but not always. And I guess, I mean, the way I approached it with the 7/7 thing was that I theorized, this is speculation, that the way it works for them is that it encourages everyone to just reinforce their own existing beliefs. So if you think, oh no, this stuff's ludicrous, it's just a bunch of hokum, fiction, conspiracy theory, the fact that it's on a TV show will just reinforce that. Oh, it's just the sort of stupid thing a Hollywood writer would come up with.
For
right?
sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, how often...
But that also... well, I was going to say, but that also cuts the other way. So with the people who, for whatever reason, believe all of these things are inside jobs or somehow state-sponsored, they also have their opinions reinforced and that worldview reinforced, which, again, it takes them away from actually exploring the evidence and maybe doing something with that evidence. So it just encourages it as a kind of vague mentality rather than anything that actually has any consequence. So both of those results, I think the CIA or MI5 or whoever probably fine with. You know, they can live with that.
They end up on top. I mean, even, how many times have you heard if you mention a conspiracy theory to someone, they're just like, oh, that was a movie or that was on TV. That's not real. And so, no matter what the facts are, they're just not going to take you seriously anymore. It's just an interesting, and I think we have gone into a little more speculation here, but interesting to wonder if this isn't a tactic that they use to just kind of, either just to kind of belittle people that are finding making alternative interpretations of what's going on outside of what you're getting from the mainstream media.
Well, and I mean, I did do on my podcast on Clandestine a few episodes back, I did quite a lengthy study of the whole notion of false flag terrorism as it relates to training exercises. Because, you have this hypothesis that, if there was an exercise anywhere nearby in any way somehow related to this event, then therefore it must have been a false flag. That thing's been in the water supply for a long time, and sometimes it's more plausible than others.
Right.
I found, going back decades, films and TV shows that were sponsored in some way by the state that contain that idea. In fact, I found so many of them that you really do start to wonder, is this an idea they want us to believe?
Interesting.
And certainly it's an idea they don't seem to have much problem with, because it turns up time and time and time again. Movies like GoldenEye and Enemy of the State employ this idea. And we know that GoldenEye was reviewed by the Pentagon and that they did remove stuff from that script, but they didn't remove that. We know that Enemy of the State involved CIA support and possibly the NSA as well. No one removed that from the script. So clearly it's not an idea they have that much problem with. Otherwise, they would have done something about it, wouldn't they?
Yeah, that's fascinating, actually. That's really interesting. So why don't we switch over then and talk? I want to talk a little bit about Oliver Stone and other directors that you mentioned in the book that really, I mean, at least they're doing their best to be sort of hard-hitting against the system, and yet somehow they end up being watered down. Even more controversial movies that they may have made don't get made or get watered down. Because I think some people are going to be listening to this and saying, well, hey, no, I know, Oliver Stone or Michael Moore, they're making these really anti-war films or anti-establishment films, so they can't all be censored or repressed in some way.
Oh, no, I mean, we say it in the book. Hollywood is quite a broad church. It does involve quite a lot of different sorts of people making quite a lot of different sorts of films. And most of those films, to be fair, are being made without anything to do with the government, really. So that part of the process just simply doesn't apply to most of Hollywood's output, I would suggest. But nonetheless, the Hollywood studios themselves are quite conservative in a small c sense, that they're risk averse. They don't want to really go upsetting any apple carts. So they want a little bit of risk and drama and maybe a little bit of radical ideas in their films just to spice things up a bit because, it helps keep people interested in a very repetitive product.
Right.
But they certainly don't want to go seriously pissing anyone off, generally speaking. Then you get people like Oliver Stone, who tried. You know, the guy did try. He made movies taking serious shots at Wall Street, taking serious shots at Vietnam. He even made JFK, which one might argue is the most politically influential Hollywood film of all time. It seriously contributed to getting that whole thing at least somewhat reopened, and some kind of acknowledgement from the government that no, far too much of this is being kept secret, given how long had passed by that point. And, you know, you're talking 30 years later, and they're still saying, oh no, you just can't see those documents. Well, that film did seriously help turn that around, and maybe one day that means we actually get some real information about the JFK assassination that we might actually be able to answer some of our questions. And that's a big thing for a movie to accomplish. You know, that's not nothing. So the guy tried. And then, you know, inevitably he butts up against the Hollywood machine. He starts, you know, finding it harder and harder to get these projects financed. He almost gives up at one point and goes and makes trash like World Trade Center.
Right.
I mean, and this is a guy who'd made relatively public statements suggesting, you know, he thought something was deeply wrong with 9/11, or at least that, you know, it wasn't as advertised. And then he goes and makes World Trade Center, which is just this, you know, flag-waving, pro-America piece of dreck, really.
Yeah, that was strange. I mean, like, where did that come from?
I guess he got offered a bunch of money, and at that point he was struggling in Hollywood, and he just thought, sod it, why not?
Yeah, sure.
And I can't particularly blame him, but this is what we mean, that filmmakers, and it's particularly when they're early on in their career, you could say the same things happened to Michael Moore. When was the last time Michael Moore actually made a subversive movie? Back in the 90s, he was making some. Early 2000s, he was making some. Last 10 years, last 12, 15 years, not so much, really.
For sure. And even the 9/11 movie.
Political films, but they're not that kind of hard-hitting. So, yeah, like you say, inevitably just sort of seems to get watered down. They just bash up against the limits of the industry, and that's that. Sorry, what were you going to say about Fahrenheit 9/11?
Oh, I just, you know, even that movie really didn't seem to go very far. I mean, there was so much more information that you know, he could have gone into. It was mainstreaming, you know, so much, and not going deeply into a lot of the questions that people have about 9/11. So.
Yeah, but I guess if you had done that, then there was no chance of that getting a wide release, and there was certainly no chance of it winning an Oscar.
That's for sure. Yeah.
This is what you can see, that this is the effect of the Hollywood machine, that, just like I say, they're risk averse. They don't want to throw millions of dollars at something that might actually piss someone off. But of course, if you tell the truth, you're bound to piss someone off. You just are.
Yeah,
so they don't tend to make movies that tell a lot of truth.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of basically how the dynamic works.
Well, all right, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left in the show, so we should be wrapping it up. But I wanted to mention before we go that there are other ways besides just direct Pentagon influence that do water down these movies. You talk in the book about a couple of other ways, product placement being one, where, you know, you've just got so much money that are riding on these things. And I don't know about you, but I, for one, I don't really separate the corporate structure from the government structure so much. They seem to work pretty closely hand in hand. So, you know, when it comes to like not pissing people off and you're trying to make $100 million on product placement, you know, what influence does something like this have on the script? I mean, you've got then dozens of corporations in every movie that are trying to get their product into a blockbuster, but then they want their product to look good. You know, they want it to be put in a certain scene in a certain way, so they're going to have input on the script. Can you discuss this a little bit?
Well, I mean, I don't think they have the same kind of influence on the script as the Pentagon say. I don't think Coca-Cola is phoning them up and giving them script notes in such a kind of explicit way. Mm-hmm. But like you say, they want to be associated. They want to be associated with the hero, usually in the movie. Is what it comes down to. Is whoever's the good guy, whoever we're rooting for in this film, they have to be somehow associated with our brand. Or if your brand is a location, say, you have a lot these days of kind of rising developing nations, or even now developed nations, have a lot of cash on hand, and so they're saying, come and film in our country, come and show off our country as either just for tourism purposes or, just as kind of general PR for the nation.
Mm-hmm.
Come and we'll give you tens of millions of dollars for coming and filming in Dubai or whatever. So there again, they might not have that same kind of direct, explicit influence over the script, but they're still, creating a vested interest that it means the producers don't want to piss them off. Well, and so, they're never going to make a movie set in Dubai claiming $30 million in tax credits from the Dubai government, saying what the Dubai government is actually like, are they?
Absolutely. And that was another really important point that the book brought up, was that then when you have governments and locations giving deals to these big Hollywood films for production costs, then you really what you're starting to have then is not even just American propaganda getting into these films, but it could be Dubai or Saudi Arabia, or in some cases the Chinese government, that are starting to have some influence over this kind of thing. It's like, well, wow. I mean,
we did cite one example in the book with Spectre, the James Bond movie, 2015 James Bond movie. And this came out in the Sony hack, right? That the Mexican government had not just given them a whole bunch of money, but seems to have gone around their usual tax rebate and whatever it is, their usual mechanism for giving money back to filmmakers who come and film in Mexico. They seem to have done a special deal outside of that actually granted them some influence over the script. So in that opening sequence, instead of the the gangster character that Bond confronts in Mexico City, instead of them being a Mexican criminal, they're just some kind of international gangster fixer character.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted the first Bond girl that appears in that scene. They wanted her to be cast as a major Mexican actress. So these are creative, politicized decisions that did change. I mean, Sony turned around and said, oh, no, we didn't actually change all of that. These documents don't actually represent those negotiations. But you watch the film, and it's all in keeping with what the Mexican government asked for. So you can only assume they did. That deal was struck along those terms. So they do sometimes have that same kind of influence over the script and influence over creative decision-making. And I do wonder, not that we explicitly get into this in the book, but it is a line of my thinking that, particularly in this field, you see nations acting almost like nationalistic corporations, right? That they have a brand.
For sure.
Promote.
Yeah.
So this is why you see things like Azerbaijan paying enormous amounts of money to host a Grand Prix or to have the Eurovision Song Contest. It's because they want to promote Azerbaijan almost as a product in itself, which is a pretty bizarre way for a nation to look at itself. But this is, I guess, what you get with globalization.
Well, it is interesting.
Yeah, go on.
Well, just in our conversation, like you mentioned globalization just then, they're blurring the line between the corporate and the government world. I mean, what are they? Maybe the governments are just big corporations now, and big corporations are just little governments, or,
Well, sometimes not so little government.
Yeah,
but yeah,
right.
Certainly when you look at their behavior, they have a similar set of vested interest in mind, and they act in very similar ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, as a result of this, it's not like Heineken, say, well, actually, we did find an example of Heineken making a little change to a James Bond movie, but it's not like Budweiser have a consistent process of rewriting Hollywood scripts.
Yeah.
It's more that if you want to get them in your movie and to give you some money to try and pay for this $250 million monstrosity that you're making,
right?
It's like, you're going to need some product placement if that's the kind of money you're going to spend, aren't you? So,
well, one of the things,
if you want that, you kind of, again, you don't want to upset the apple cart, and the apple cart is, consumerism is good. Keep buying, keep working, keep supporting the system. Don't piss anyone off.
Yeah.
That's kind of the basic philosophy behind that relationship. And as a result, just in lots of little ways, Hollywood becomes ever more conservative, ever more frightened of taking risks, ever more unoriginal and kind of endlessly based around rebooting and remaking and all of the stuff that we see dominating Hollywood today, where there's just so little originality in it. And that's, for one thing, that's the sad part of this story for me, is that I like films. I like entertainment. Who doesn't? But I want to see some stuff that's creative and surprising and unusual. rather than just the same old Budweiser-sponsored, DoD-supported schlock.
You know, that was one of the things that and it's perfect. We're hitting on about an hour, so we should be winding down. But why don't we kind of end with this overview? Like, what do you think Hollywood would look like without this kind of influence? You know, I mean, you start to realize that, my God, you know, another thing you bring up, you talk about the big six. I mean, there's really only a few major media corporations that are making all of these blockbuster films. So you're not getting a lot of small, independent, creative movies. And you know, certainly the vast majority of what's getting pushed on you comes from these six major corporations. And they're the ones that are making these huge films that are influenced by all this corporate stuff and by all this by the Pentagon and the CIA and all this propaganda stuff. I mean, what would entertainment look like without it? I mean, if we actually had just, you know, creative individuals saying what they wanted. You know, what I'm getting at, too, in a broader sense is, you know, like, what is propaganda? What is censorship? What would art in a free society look like without all of this? Because I think it would be remarkably different. You know, it would be very, very different from the kind of stuff we're getting now that is more controlled than than I think the average person really realizes.
I suppose I'm in two minds over this. Part of me thinks, yes, it probably would look quite different. The other part of me says, if you're making mass entertainment for a mass market, then inevitably you're going to do something like a Michael Bay movie.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So there would still be that, you know, the market force of, if you're going to spend $200 million making a movie and you want to try and make back $700 million, then you're basically just going to have to tick a load of boxes and give the people what they want.
Mm-hmm.
But there would certainly be more room for films like The East and Kill the Messenger. They're two that we mention in the book, relatively recent films that really do contain profoundly subversive material and get into some areas that most films just wouldn't touch. Now, both of these films were made for a few $1 million each. Neither one of them made a profit, I don't think.
Yeah.
Neither one was very widely distributed or marketed. You only really find out about them if you're, you know, a film buff who's into this kind of thing. So, you know, those films are out there. Hollywood does make these films, but they're usually very much on the lower end of the spectrum financially and in terms of attention drawn to them and so on. So I think we'd get more of those. I think that would be the fundamental difference, is that there'd be more room for people to take, you know, $5 million and go make something that looks lovely, that's got good actors, it's, you know, good production values, but that has the freedom to explore aspects of the real world or the fantasy world that just otherwise don't tend to get touched.
Right.
I think that would be the fundamental difference.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you talk about, too, is how Hollywood so often regurgitates propaganda that comes from the news. That Flight 93 kind of comes to mind when it's like, here, we're just going to tell you what we think happened, you know, and the way the news kind of put it out there, and we're going to turn it into a big Hollywood blockbuster. But it's regurgitating more of the same kind of propaganda that you've been hearing on the news. And so it's reinforcing. I guess what makes me think about this is that, I mean, you know, pop culture, and especially what's coming out of Hollywood, is so huge in terms of the social engineering. Like, I mean, I like to hope, anyway, that the culture itself would be better. Like, people would start to want better movies, you know, if they were given movies that made them think and become better people, right?
Yeah, it would help create more of a market for those. It would help create more of an expectation for that sort of art. Yeah, of course, yeah. And so gradually, over a longer period of time, yes, I think you would see more and more of those kind of things. You'd see more demand for them, more expectation of them, and yeah, just more of them getting made and actually being talked about. And you would see cinema having a greater influence over politics, because right now, I'm not sure if it does, or in as much as it does, it's mostly the pro-war stuff. There are very few movies that have much of a positive political impact. I'd say there's a fair few that have quite a lot of negative. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that dynamic could be reversed. Yeah.
Well, all right, Tom, we've gotten a little over an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make?
Well, just that if people want to learn more about this, there's dozens more examples of manipulation of scripts and so on that we haven't been able to touch on today. So if you want to learn more about that, and that, to my mind, is the key information in the book, then yeah, go check it out. National Security Cinema. We've been working very hard on this for a number of years, bringing all of this stuff together. We haven't done it lightly. We think this is a serious issue. We think this is something people need to know about and deserve to know about. So, yeah, go check out the book. And like I say, if you want to sort of get some more background material or listen to my podcast or any of that sort of stuff, then go to spyculture.com, because that's my site where I get into all of this stuff in endless detail, to be honest.
All right. And if you like what you've heard today on The Shift, then please help us out. You can go to our Patreon account at patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to find out more about what we're doing here at the production, you can get us on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty, or join the conversation on Twitter at Doug McKenty. And again, I want to thank Tom Secker for coming. He is the co-author of National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. And if you want to find out more, again, check him out at spyculture.com. I think this is a great topic for conversation, and I think that more people should talk about it, because as Tom said, the influence of the government corporate complex over what we're hearing is kind of watered down, talked about very little, and generally conservatively. But I think, as Tom has figured out, maybe this is a bigger deal than a lot of us think, and it's definitely worth our time to look into it a little bit more. So thanks again, Tom. Really appreciate you being on The Shift.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
All right. Take care, everyone.